Alright, it's been a couple weeks since we talked. Hope you guys had a good spring break. I was trying to play catch up, and I had the notion of sending you guys a homework assignment and a quiz, etc. over spring break, but I decided not to. I figured that you guys did enough of that with the exploratory studies. I didn't want to do it again. I thought it'd just be busy work, and it really wasn't needed. But as we move forward to the observational studies, keep in mind you can still run a PICOS on your observational studies just as easily as you did with the exploratory studies. You can run your strobe just as easily as you ran the Prisma. I just don't want to do it. I didn't want you guys to think like I'm just having you do things to do things, but understand that those terms, etc., might still come up as you read through your observational studies. So the point of this little video right now is to kind of give you a review of some of the things you're going to come across in the observational studies, and obviously moving ahead, looking forward. So a couple terms and a couple things you might want to know, which I didn't include in the lecture notes from last week. First thing is epidemiological studies are great in the observational world. You're going to see a lot of those. I didn't really mention them because I didn't want to come off as being too medically inclined, too much of an athletic trainer. I was trying to keep my options broad and sort of be applicable to everyone taking this course. But keep in mind you're going to see a lot of epidemiological studies in the observational world, and they do fall in that category. Three terms you're probably going to come across relatively common in observational studies are relative risk, odds ratios, and hazard risk or hazard ratios. And they're very similar, but they just have slight differences. So if you see them, just kind of want you to know what you're going to be getting into. So if you see something called relative risk or the risk ratio, etc., it's basically the risk of those exposed versus the risk of those who are not exposed to a condition, a pathology, disease, whatever. That's what it's comparing. Okay, it's a comparison of those two groups. The odds ratios is the probability that the event will occur compared to the probability the event will not occur. In other words, it is a ratio of the odds of an exposure versus the odds of exposure against control group. And that's an important difference. When you look at the type of studies which are going to be using this, odds ratios can be calculated for both a cohort study and a case control study, because an odds ratio is looking at the case and a control. So you have those two groups. A relative risk ratio can only be used for a cohort study because you don't have the control group of a relative risk. Right? So hopefully the authors have understood that, and they will use the appropriate ratio, either odds ratio or relative risk ratio, for whatever their studies they're going to be running. And the final one is the hazard ratio. You're going to see a lot of these in epidemiological studies, and the hazard ratios, again, are very similar to the other two, except they take into account time, and it's usually time to an event. So it's the risk of any hazard of something happening to an event time, and depressingly enough, a lot of that is time to death. So a lot of hazard ratios are looking at cancer rates, cardiovascular failure, etc., and that would be the time of event, it would be death. And then they go back and they look at the cohort, they look at the case control, and they calculate the hazard ratio of this group has a higher hazard of dying from this disease, etc. So that's where you're going to come across these three terms, and there are various ways to calculate it. Basically, they use a 2x2 contingency table, which is what I kind of showed you with the chi-square. It's the same idea. You have the 2x2 table, and then it depends on where you put a numerator and denominator. You can do all the calculations, etc. I don't want to bog you down with that, but if you are interested, plenty of studies out there and websites. Just Google odds ratio, relative risk, and hazard risk, and they'll talk to you all about it. But the one key thing to keep in mind when you talk about all three of those is the number one. Okay? What you're going to see, again, with your forest plots, we're bringing back the forest plots, this is going to be the number one. And because these are comparison ratios, to get a number one, that means the numerator is equal to the denominator, which means there's no difference. So we don't want to be crossing the number one in our forest plots. But if you see something that says you have, let's say, a relative risk greater than 1, like 1.5, what that means is that you have a 1.5 times likely to get the disease or the pathology or whatever. Okay? Obviously, equal to 1 means there's no difference. And less than 1 is what we call a protective effect. That means you're going to get a negative effect. So that's actually a good thing. You want a protective effect. And I don't know if it's cynicism, I don't know what it is, but most studies nowadays, it seems, this is anecdotal on my part, but most studies seems really like to publish the greater than 1 type studies. You have an increased risk of heart disease if this happens. You have an increased risk of premature death if this happens. So we like to talk about what's going to kill you as opposed to the less than 1 studies that say, well, these are protective effects for you. So as you read your studies, as you go through cohort, case control, and other observational studies, keep those in mind. You might see those. We talked about the chi-square last time. Also, keep in mind that you do regressions and correlations. I encourage you to go back a couple units and read those 3 articles again. The last article is on regressions and correlations. Does a very good job of outlining it. Go back through and read that and review yourself. My one take-home point about correlations, remember, correlation does not equal causation. Those are not the same thing. But go back through, read that article, because again, you're probably going to see a lot of correlation regression, statistical analysis leading to hazard ratio risk. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is something you might read about. It's called the confounding relationship, or the confounding factors, or the confounding variables. You get these a lot in cohort studies or case controls or any of your observational studies. And what this basically is saying is that you have 2 risk factors, and they both are contributing to 1 variable, but only one of them is being reported on. So, for instance, if you take something like, let's take alcohol. Let's take alcohol drinking. So you have alcohol drinking, and you say it leads to heart disease. Okay? Very, very simple. So you have this relationship. You think that's the variable that's causing that. Easy enough. The problem is, let's say you have obesity down here as another risk factor, but you're not including that in your study. What you actually have then is this little triangle gets formed, and now obesity becomes a confounding factor or confounding variable in this relationship, okay? And this can really throw off the results, etc., moving forward. So anytime you read these things, they should disclose any confounding variables and what they did to limit it. And much like we talked about all our other biases from units before, you can really do a good job of limiting these type of confounding variables through blinding, randomization, etc. Same basic things that we have been doing. So as you read some of these things, you come across these terms, just kind of get used to seeing the different names of the ratios. If you see something like a confounding variable, etc., you read these different observational studies. Now, finally, moving ahead to our next sort of things you're doing in this unit. We are going to have a paper assigned. It's going to be due next week, and the paper is going to be a little bit different than the exploratory paper. What I'm basically just going to ask you to do is more of taking all the units we've done so far and kind of put them together in this one paper. So the rubric, I've tried to make the rubric a little bit more specific and prescriptive, so hopefully you can really just follow it and see where we're going with it. But what you're going to be basically doing is using systematic reviews, etc., to find two different types of observational studies. Basically around the same topic. So pick a general topic that you can find 2 different types of studies. So 1 case control, 1 cohort study, 1 case study, etc. And kind of when you find those 2 studies, all I want you to do is basically a summary of those 2 studies. So you don't have to give your impression or your opinion or anything like that on these studies. The other thing is that the peer evals will be done this year. This time they are going to be randomly assigned via Canvas. So I am not manually assigning this. That means you could be reading a paper in an area that is not in your wheelhouse. You don't really have a lot of information about, but that's okay, because the paper should just be a summary of the 2 studies, so you might actually learn a little bit more. And part of being in this program is developing a breadth of knowledge. We always worry about depth of knowledge, but we're going to have a little bit more breadth of kinesiology, health sciences, etc. So that's never a bad thing. So as you read the rubric and get comfortable, we're going to ask you to do a little bit more background work, taking through the other units, etc. There will be another reading that I want you to do on how to evaluate observational studies. I had you look over to Strobe. The Strobe is very similar to the Prisma. It's a guideline, but it should not be used to assess it. And the article I have you read for this week will actually talk more about that. And what it is actually a systematic review, which reviewed a whole bunch of different assessment tools out there for observational studies. So again, you're going to have to kind of read that systematic review, pull out a couple assessment tools, find your own observational studies, etc. So this is really a good exercise for you to get used to going through the literature, finding different articles, appraising them, and seeing how they fit into your discipline, your profession. For the EDD students or the master students, this would be really good practice for you when you start looking at your dissertation. You have a good idea. How do you find more topics on it? How you can go for a reference list, pull various topics, see the good studies from the poor studies, etc. For those who are not doing a master's thesis or a dissertation, this is just good practice on how to further improve your professional practice. So, have any questions, comments, concerns? Always email me. Always available to talk to you guys. And then we'll be moving forward going into the last couple of weeks, and that's going to be observational going into relational studies. So look forward to hearing from you. Good luck, and I will check in next week.